My name is Janice Gregory, and I want to introduce our panel and get us rolling. The final session today is on exploring options to strengthen Social Security. And I want to note, especially in light of the talk we just heard, that strengthen Social Security is an interesting word that seems to have been picked up. It's the lingo for all sorts of proposals, from adding new benefits to adding new revenues to partially or radically reducing benefits. They all come under the rubric of strengthening Social Security. Driving this are several things: projections that we will need to make changes in about 25 years or sooner, combined with political agendas to change the form or impact of this cornerstone New Deal program, combined with a felt need to reduce federal spending across the board. And our panelists are going to explore this landscape. But before they do, I want to offer you one thought, and that's a thought about the, quote, highly paid. Now, this is a messaging word. After all, highly paid don't need Social Security, or they don't need it as much, right? And highly paid but now think again about highly paid in the conversations that we hear today. Highly paid, $250,000 and above. Highly paid, $1 million and above, right? Isn't that that's what pops into my head? Well, I'd like us to look first, before we begin, at who's highly paid under Social Security. It's a very different issue. I am going to scrupulously avoid decimals in what I'm about to say, and point out that the top 1% of earners in the United States make up somewhere around $380,000 a year, which just happens to coincide with the top tax rate of 35%. The top 5% earn about $188,000. The top 10% earn about $140,000. Everybody else earns below that. Everybody else below that is still higher than the top paid, the highly paid under Social Security. A high earner under Social Security is not a $380,000 a year lobbyist or financier. It's a $69,000 worker, school teacher. The maximum earner under Social Security is about $107,000. So highly paid under Social Security is radically different from highly paid when we think about the tax world. Only about 2% of all Social Security benefits go to people who earn above $100,000. A fairly middle class, certainly middle class salary in the current universe in which we live. So when we think about highly paid, when we think about strengthening Social Security, I think we want to keep in mind the population that we're really talking about here are really our neighbors, are the people who are policemen, firefighters, school teachers, grocery store workers. These are the people we're talking about. So let's look at what our options are to strengthen Social Security. And we have three very distinguished panel members, and I'm going to introduce them very briefly. Their full bios are in your packet. First, we'll have Elaine Fultz, who's former director of the ILO, International Labor Organization Office for Russia, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia. And she's going to give us a look at lessons from Central Europe about Social Security. Next will come Ken Buffin, who is president of Buffin Partners, and has been an actuary, statistician, and economist for over 30 years, and he's going to talk about Social Security obstacles and opportunities. And then wrapping us up is Meizhu Liu, who describes herself as a professional troublemaker. And she's most recently been director of Closing the Racial Gap Initiative at the Insight Center for Community Economic Development. And her presentation is Social Security, now in 3D Technicolor, a different kind of messaging. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Elaine. We'll have our presentations and then time for questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Janice. I'm from Philadelphia, and I'm retired from the International Labor Organization, which, for those of you who are not familiar with the ILO, is one of the United Nations organizations. It's one of the family of UN organizations that has a mandate to try to improve working conditions all around the world. And Social Security is a big part of that mandate. The ILO has a Social Security Department that provides technical assistance to governments and workers and employer associations in all different regions of the world. When I was working for the ILO, I worked in Africa, in Central Europe, in Russia, and in Central Asia. And the policy advice that I gave was based on the ILO conventions on Social Security, which are sort of minimum standards that are agreed to by the ILO member states. And these standards look at Social Security very much from the point of view of the worker. They are concerned with financial sustainability, but also very much so with social sustainability, meaning benefit adequacy, and also very much with the participation of the system constituents, that is, workers and employers and governments, in policymaking, which often does not happen in many countries of the world. So today in my presentation, I want to look at the topic of this conference, that is social insurance in a market economy, through the lens of recent experience in Central Europe, which is an area of the world where most of the governments decided that in a market economy, they did not need social insurance. They could rely on private arrangements. But as I hope to show to you, to prove to you, these turned out to be very poor substitute. So now I need technical assistance. There you go. No, too far. Okay, so the trend that swept Central Europe a little over a decade ago was what's often called pension privatization, and by that I mean the replacement or the partial replacement of social insurance with privately managed individual investment accounts. I say investment rather than savings because they can go down as well as up. There's no guarantee of the maintenance of the principal as there is usually in a savings account. And probably as most people in this room know or are vaguely aware at least, this shift occurred in two regions of the world. In Latin America, where Chile was the leader of the region and adopted this approach in the early 1980s, and also in Central Europe, where after the fall of the Soviet Union and the disintegration of the Soviet bloc, many countries decided to follow this policy prescription. And in this region, Hungary and Poland were the leaders, both passing legislation to privatize their pension systems in 1997. From this slide, you can see that after they did this, with Hungary implementing the system in 1998 and Poland in 1999, many countries followed in rapid sequence. And by 2008, 8 more countries, so a total of 10, had privatized their national pension systems. And this means that a majority of the new EU member states, that is, those EU member states that joined recently after coming out of the Soviet bloc, have these individual accounts as a partial substitute for social insurance. However, this story is still unfolding. And the story I want to tell you today is sort of the second half of this, which is to say that just as Hungary and Poland were the leaders in creating privatized social security in Central Europe in the late 90s, since the global economic crisis, they have been the leaders in retrenching this form, this alternative to social insurance. In December 2010, Hungary eliminated its second pillar individual savings accounts, repealed them, and recouped the money that was in most workers' individual accounts back into the state budget. This is akin to what happened in Argentina in 2008. Some of you are familiar with that. In Poland, 4 months later, in April 2011, the government enacted a very large cut in the rate of contributions that were diverted to these individual accounts from over 7% to just over 2%. So they maintained the second pillar, but they really cut it back. You can also see from this table that 5 other countries so far have retrenched these second-tier systems in one way or the other, either by reducing the revenues that go into them or by making them optional for workers, although so far the other countries have called these retrenchments temporary. They have said, when economic conditions get better, we'll put it back the way it was. So there is an open question about whether Hungary and Poland will be the leaders in retrenchment, and eventually the other countries will adopt permanent changes or not. Now, the obvious reason for this retrenchment is fiscal. That is to say, all these second-tier savings systems were financed by diverting part of the revenues from the public pension systems. And in all the countries that did this, this created a hole, a big hole in the financing of the public pension system. And in all the countries, the laws were silent about how the hole in public pension finance would be filled. Several of the governments said, oh, we're going to cut public benefits and get rid of the gap by reducing the outlays of the public system, but ultimately none of them did this. Instead, they reverted to borrowing. And at the time that the global economic crisis hit in the fall of 2008, both Hungary and Poland were borrowing about the equivalent of 1.5% of GDP per year, so a huge amount of money, just in order to make up for the hole in public pension finance that was caused by sending the money to these individual accounts. As the global economic crisis hit, credit became scarce and more expensive, and this led to the retrenchment of these schemes. Now, what I just told you was the story you usually read in the newspapers or in the media. But my own belief, and what I want to convey to you today, is that while these fiscal problems were a catalyst for retrenchment, this is not the full story. They were not the root cause. I think we have to look deeper because the governments decided to cut the second-tier schemes, the individual savings, rather than the public pension systems. And we can't explain that just by being in tight fiscal conditions. Something else was going on here. And what else was going on has to do with the topic of this conference, which is the need for social insurance in a market economy. So to illustrate the underlying problem that led to these retrenchments, I want to move back for just a second to 1997, when both governments, Hungary and Poland, adopted these systems. And note that the laws they passed had to do only with the accumulation of money in the individual accounts and how that would work. They said practically nothing about what benefits would be paid out of those accounts. So the benefit package was missing or incomplete in both of the countries. They both said, oh, we have plenty of time. We aren't going to pay benefits for at least 15 years. We'll go back to that and do that later. But this turned out to be highly challenging. And the challenges had to do with the hybrid status of this second pillar. That is, it was publicly mandated, meaning workers were required to participate, and this arguably created some responsibility for the government to make sure it was fairly operated and provided reasonable benefits on the one hand. And on the other hand, these systems were privately managed, so publicly mandated but privately managed. So they were subject to the constraints that individual pension funds face when they operate in private competitive markets. Now, the politicians in both countries knew exactly what they wanted in the way of a benefit package. And this kind of conflict between will the private principles prevail or will the public principles prevail, led to three big sticking points. The first of these was the preservation of purchasing power. They wanted the private benefits to maintain their value over time. And this was really quite important in these countries because during the period of socialism, the Soviet Union denied the existence of inflation, and no pensions were inflation adjusted. They said this is a problem in the West. We don't have this here. But in fact, there was inflation, and pensioners got poorer every year, and their pensions were never adjusted. So providing inflation-proof pensions was very important to the new governments in Hungary and Poland. Second, they wanted equal treatment for men and women. And in both countries, they defined this as meaning that a man and a woman who worked the same number of years and were the same age and retired at the same time and had the same balance in their individual account at the time that they retired should receive the same monthly benefit. That's the way they define gender equality. And I think that's a good definition, but we also know that women tend to live longer than men. So in order to provide that kind of equality, there has to be a kind of cross-subsidy within the system. And third, both the governments were very intent on rewarding longer work. They had inherited very low retirement ages from the Soviet period, and early retirement was rampant. So they hoped and expected that these reforms would lead people to work longer. Each of these priorities for the benefit package turned out to be highly problematic. To preserve purchasing power, we need regular cost of living increases, and this is one of the great strengths of national social security systems, but very difficult for private funds to provide regular COLAs. In terms of gender equality, these individual accounts had to be annuitized at the time of retirement. Okay? That is, changed from a lump sum into a flow of monthly benefits. And to make this conversion, it's necessary to make a guess about life expectancy. So would the private funds use one life expectancy table that combined the averages for men and women, or separate ones? Private funds tend to use separate ones, which would mean that women would on average get 15 or 20% less than men for the same amount of savings. Of course, they could be mandated to use unisex tables, but if they did, then the private funds would have really an incentive to discriminate against women. They'd like to avoid them because on average they live longer. So it would require some regulation, not an easy issue to deal with. And finally, to the importance of rewarding longer work was problematic. They thought that shifting from DB to DC schemes would do this. But what they didn't pay attention to was the challenge in designing a seamless integration between retirement investment accounts that were based on capitalized savings and disability pensions, which continued to be based on social insurance principles. This is not impossible, but very difficult, and neither government did a good job of this. As a result, both systems had work disincentives and high costs to the public system because this seamlessness was not so seamless. So, to move toward my conclusion, between 2007, when these laws were passed, and between 1997, when these two laws were passed, and 2008, when the global crisis hit, there were several attempts by both governments to enact into law a benefit package, and each of these attempts failed, either because they passed what I would call good social insurance policy, but it was impossible to implement, or because it was opposed by the private funds themselves, or because they passed laws that were designed to do what the private funds could do, no cost of living increase, gender inequality, and they were vetoed. So what I think we see here, to sum up, is a mismatch between the benefit package that policymakers sought and the ones that the private funds were able and willing to provide. The private benefit packages got caught in a quandary that resisted resolution for more than a decade. And the stalemate, the inability to address these problems, eventually weakened the support of key stakeholders in both countries. And when the global economic crisis hit, it was the catalyst for second-tier retrenchment, but it was not the root cause. So I would say, to sum up, this was a very painful experience for these countries. They regained their national independence. They embraced the concept of capitalism and private markets. They thought private Social Security went hand in hand with this. They adopted radical reforms, and then they rapidly had to reverse them. I think they learned the painful way that what their workers needed and what their politicians insisted on was not possible except with the broad pooling of risks and resources that comes with a national social insurance system. So I think that while these countries of Central Europe often look to the U.S. as a source of guidance and inspiration on their social policies, this is a case where their experience is of very real relevance to our own policy discussions at the moment. This is a precautionary tale that I think that we should keep very much on the radar screen as we consider future steps in Social Security. I commend and thank Nasi for putting it on the agenda. And if you're interested in this story that I just told, I have written it, and it's going to appear soon in the International Social Security Review. So thank you.
Ken? Thank you. Yes, we may.
Good afternoon. The theme of our conference is social insurance, obstacles and opportunities. And I'm going to talk about social security just in the narrow aspect of the OA SDI program, and then to pick up on this theme of reframing the public debate. We have a very fine, strong program, but it has been criticized, it is misunderstood, it is misrepresented. And so reframing the public debate, I think, will take these three key points from this next slide as objectives. One is to shore up public confidence in the program. And then secondly, to address misunderstandings, misperceptions, so to contrast these misperceptions with reality. There's an important message there that we have to communicate in terms of getting the system and its financings explained carefully and accurately. And then all of the negative attacks for ideological reasons or for deliberate misrepresentation, we have to speak truth to power. So those are the three motivations. Those are the three objectives that I will attempt to address, and that's the underlying objective of the four particular issues that I have chosen to address. And on these next bullet points, you'll see that I've chosen the issue of solvency, which I'm going to address in terms of the cash flow adequacy of the OASDI system. That is, comparing the ability of the available cash flow resources to meet scheduled benefits and expenses. The second issue to address will be the nature of the trust funds, the assets and the liquidity. There are huge misunderstandings, misrepresentations, and statements that are simply not factual regarding the trust fund. The third item that I will address is the critical issue of what happens to the assets in the trust fund, the surplus that is built up from the excess of contributions coming into Social Security over the outgo for benefits and expenses. Those assets from the trust fund are lent to the federal government, who in turn spends them. So this raises the issue of the so-called spent or lent dilemma. And this is an important issue that I think we all need to be much more attuned to, much more aware of, and need to address. And then the fourth issue that I will attempt to address is the one of the sustainability and affordability. Is the system sustainable? Is the system affordable? What do we need to do to strengthen Social Security in terms of making it sustainable and indeed affordable? So let's just take these one at a time. We can look at solvency in many different ways. The Trustees Report presents some very detailed analysis of the financial condition of the system. It presents the values of the cash flows represented in both the income and the outgo side. On the outgo side, that is the requirement to pay scheduled benefits and expenses. The cash flow income, if you think about it, has three principal components. It is not only the taxable payroll contributions, the FICA contributions, but also the buildup of the cash resources that are in the trust fund and the interest earned on those investments. Those particular assets are indeed intended to pay benefits, so we should not get upset when we see projections with the rundown of those particular assets. What I have chosen to do in terms of addressing the various solvency measures is to just look at the actuarial projections that are published. I compliment the fine work that is done by the Office of Chief Actuary, Steve Goss and Alice Wade. If they're in the room, I compliment you for the outstanding work you do. My work has simply taken their good work and extracted some of the key components and then interpreted them. I choose to look at the solvency over various periods. We have an official 75-year projection period, but the actuarial reports also project over 25 years and 50 years and 75 years. And indeed, there's also a short-term 10-year projection. But I'm going to concentrate on the condition of the OA SDI program, looking at it in 25, 50, and 75 years. Now, you all know that every time the Trustees Report is published, the first thing you read in the press next morning is the Social Security Trust Fund will become exhausted in year X. And then the opponents say that Social Security is facing a meltdown. There'll be no money left to meet the benefits for the next generation. But if you stop and think about it, and you look just in isolation at the next 25 years, and you look at the availability of those cash resources to meet the scheduled benefits and expenses, you actually have perfect 100% solvency on a cash flow adequacy test basis. So this is a message that I think we need to pick up and communicate, that the exhaustion point of the trust fund is not a disaster. It's simply the point at which, up to that point, we have better than 100% solvency on a cash flow adequacy basis. Now, if you then project out to 50 years, we know that we have deficits that are projected over the 75-year period. We know the Trustees Report 2.2% of taxable payroll would be required to bring it back into actuarial balance over 75 years. Let's compare the value of those two cash flows over 50 years. And the numbers, it just divide A by B, is 90%. So we've got 90% cash flow adequacy over 50 years. When we extend out to 75 years, the number is 87%. Now, those are not alarming difficult numbers, I think they represent a very strong positive message. But I don't see anyone standing up, and it isn't stated specifically in the Trustees Report, that we are 100% adequate for 25 years, 90% adequate for 50 years, and 87% adequate over 75 years. Now, it's very important that in making this test we include all of the available resources, must include the interest income and must include the maturity proceeds on the assets. Opponents will simply look at the flow of the FICA contributions coming in and the benefit outgo, and they're looking to say, well, it's now negative, it's a disaster, it's not sustainable. That is not looking at the whole true picture. Now, the bottom line, on each of my slides, I've got a bottom line message, and I think this is the message that we at Nasi have to pick up and communicate. And this message is that deficits of 10 to 13% are not unsustainable. They can be managed. We can enhance revenues, we can modify the benefit structure, but a 10 or 13% deficit is not a difficult situation to manage. We go on to the next issue. Oh, I'm back here on the trust fund assets and liquidity. Did I skip one on the? No. Okay. The trust fund assets and liquidity. What we have to understand about the nature of the system is that it is a simple intergenerational social transfer. We have the contributions coming into the system, and they pay the benefits immediately. It is not a funded system. We do, however, have a stabilization feature. We have a fixed contribution that is set at 6.2%, and that is the source of the very small, what I call buffer fund, a stabilization fund in the trust fund. There's a misunderstanding about the nature of this trust fund. It is not a funded system in the way we think of a fully funded system. It is simply, the purpose of the trust fund is simply to stabilize the contribution. So we do have a modest buildup in that trust fund. Essentially what we have is a modified pay-as-you-go basis. So we must understand that this is an intergenerational social transfer system and is simply a modified pay-as-you-go basis. The assets look very large. We have in the last Trustees Report 2.61 trillion of assets. That sounds like a large amount, but in fact it only represents 3.53 times the annual outgo. So it's a relatively small fund in that respect. The nature of the trust fund assets, they're invested, as you know, in a special issue, government security. You can think of them as benefit obligation bonds. There is a laddered portfolio. Each of the individual assets typically issued on a 15-year maturity. Those particular assets at the end of the 15 years, they are recognized, they're paid. It's just a very routine basis. They earn interest. The interest formula is that market values of interest are paid on each issue, and the particular approach taken is that the interest is assessed on the average of all outstanding federal government debt with a maturity beyond 4 years, so that that particular rate is then credited on that particular tranche of the assets in the trust fund. And if you look at the laddered portfolio of bonds held in the trust fund, you'll find that it varies from about 2.75% up to about 8% or so. And in fact, historically, if you go back just to the last year, that would be 2010 was the last year for which reported. The interest earned on the OASI part of the fund was 4.6%, and on the DI fund, 4.9%. Now, the message here is an important message, and that is that the Social Security system is a lender, not a borrower. The Social Security system does not borrow money. You hear statements made that the federal government has to borrow money from China in order to be able to pay Social Security beneficiaries. Nothing can be further from the truth. The Social Security Trust Fund is the owner of those assets. They are legal obligations of the federal government. They are lent to the federal government. The Social Security system does not borrow any money. under any circumstances. So that then leads us into the next issue. I seem to be double jumping here. Okay. The so-called spent or lent dilemma. And this is an area that causes a lot of misunderstanding. You will hear opponents of the system say there are no real assets in the trust fund, that money has been spent. They look at it as though it is simply a part of the general revenues, that the FICA contributions are not isolated and protected for the purpose that they were intended. They are simply a part of the general spending capacity of the federal government. They are spent, they are gone, there is no assets in the trust fund. Well, let's examine that and let's get the counter-argument. First, as I cannot emphasize enough that those particular securities are legal obligations of the United States Treasury. And again, I've explained that they're typically issued on a 15 maturity schedule. Interest principal payments are paid. And even though those surplus transfers are made to the U.S. Treasury and apply to current expenditure, the federal government is then responsible, Treasury is then responsible for raising the revenues to redeem those bonds and to pay interest. And that source must come from future tax revenues or borrowing. And that is the problem. That is the issue. And that's the one that we have to stand up and face. And we get into a situation of what I call the de jure or the de facto position. De jure is very clear what the legal situation is. But there is a de facto argument that we need to be aware of, because we're going to be hearing more and more of this. And the de facto argument is that from a purely economic, big picture standpoint, if we do not consider the Social Security Trust Fund as in isolation, but simply as part of all government revenues, then what we have in effect is a system that will revert to a full pay-as-you-go system. And in fact, the opening speaker on yesterday, if you reflect back, made an interesting comment. He made an observation that he felt that the policy decision, 1983, to set the trust fund up with the stabilization reserve and the fixed contribution rate was a policy error. We need to listen to that, and we need to address that. We need to know how to counter that argument. Basically, if you think about it and you look in terms of the de facto aggregate position of the federal government, if those funds are in fact utilized for other purposes other than for what they were intended for, then we have in fact reverted virtually to a full pay-as-you-go system. So I think that's a very challenging area that we have to think about, one that we have to be prepared to address. My fourth point is on the issue of sustainability and affordability. And you know all the negative stories. Social Security is not sustainable. It won't be there for the next generation. We can't afford it. It's escalating out of control. It's going to cost a huge percentage of GDP, and in aggregation with all the entitlements, it's simply unaffordable. Well, let's examine all of those particular points, and let's think about the counter-arguments. I've already described the magnitude of the 50 and 75-year projected deficits. And I'd like to just make a point about the credibility or reliability of the long-term projections. Certainly, they are very professionally developed. They are perfectly correct in terms of methodology. But there is a statement in the trust fund, Trustees Report, that says that the reliability of the projections is likely to be less certain. There's a greater degree of uncertainty the further you go out. I think it's pretty intuitively obvious. If we can make perfect projections over 10 years, I think you would have to say the 25 projections are less credible. And as you go out 50 years, you get a less credible result. And who knows, 75 years? Who can project economic and demographic situations 75 years from now? And it's very clear if you look at the three official projections, the intermediate and the high cost and the low cost, and they simply diverge, and they diverge quite dramatically. If you take the differences between the high cost and the low cost at 25 years, the difference between the high cost and low cost at 50 years, and the high cost at 70 years and low cost, you'll see very clearly that there is this diverging range of plausible outcomes, I think is the best way to describe it. So we should not place too much credibility in the validity of a 75-year projection. That does not mean to say that there's any question about the methodology or the competence of the actuaries. That's not the issue. It is all based on the assumptions going into that. Yes, okay. So I think the question is, if we want to make this sustainable, do we need a 7.2% rather than 6.2%? And then the question is that affordable? And we need to look at why we have a fixed rate constraint. We could encourage thinking about the different ways, and there are many models, and I know our next speaker will be addressing this issue about enhancing revenues. Perhaps have the contribution rate escalate over a period of 10 or 25 years until it gets to the point where we have a sufficient revenue generated to be sustainable. And I think the message that we have to take over from here is that we have changing demographics over the future years, and we need a dynamic approach to sustainability. We have to re-examine it and be flexible in terms of the construct of the system, and maybe thinking about modifying the structure of the fixed contribution. So with that, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, I want to thank all of you for all of the wonderful work you've done, and it's been great to hear about some of that over the last couple of days. And I also wanted to thank you for staying to the bitter end, and I promise that the end won't be bitter. Now, policymakers have still not figured out that in order to serve the American people of the 21st century, they need to put on their 3D glasses and notice that our country is more and more in Technicolor. In fact, in the next 3 decades, our population will be majority non-white for the very first time, and that is really a very short time away in actuarial terms. And in fact, in this decade alone, the racial and ethnic minorities accounted for 80% of our population growth. The largest growth will take place among Asian Americans and Latinos. Each of those populations will double. So almost 1 out of 3 of the people in this country will be Latino, and 1 out of 10 of us will be Asian. So it would be cool not to be such a small minority anymore. So, so we will matter. But the point is that as this is happening, we have to, as we plan for the future, really better understand these populations, because they will be the ones that will be in charge in that amount of time. Especially for children, the majority of children born in the country right now are not white, and youth will be also the majority. Youth of color will be the majority within a decade. And these are the people, these are the faces of the people we will be relying on to secure our own Social Security benefits. And when they grow up, we have 2 choices. We can either make sure that they are more secure than we are, than their parents are, and isn't that the wish of every parent, that their children be better off than they are? Or we can make them bear the brunt of cuts we impose today on the people of tomorrow. Now, why is this demographic shift important? As you can see from this graph, the shortfall, the problems in the financing will occur at the same time as this very remarkable moment, this sea change in U.S. history, when the population shifts to majority non-white. So since nobody else was doing it, we took it upon ourselves, with Nasi's blessing, to examine the economic profile of the 4 different non-white populations, so that we could really better understand how to modernize the Social Security program. Now, in terms of the past and the fact that this country has always used 2D glasses, it's important to remember that Social Security was never designed with the interests of people of color in mind. If anything, there were attempts to figure out how to exclude them from the system. So yesterday, Michael Hiltzik talked about the fact that in 1935, domestic workers and agricultural workers were excluded from Social Security, and he said that it was because we couldn't afford to cover everybody. But why choose those two groups instead of managers or manufacturing workers? Well, actually, there were quite a few Southern politicians who did not like the idea of their constituencies' hired help getting any kind of benefits that might make them think that they could leave their jobs or ever stop working under the conditions that they did. It was mentioned that in 1939, the benefits were added for the widows of men who had died, workers who had died. And at that time, most white women did not work outside of the home. However, because men of color were in such low-wage jobs, their wives often did work outside their home. And in that spousal benefit, the woman, when the husband dies, has to choose between his benefit or her benefit, which means that often a woman is getting less in Social Security benefits than the woman who is married to a high-income earner who never has worked a day in her life. Now, that's not a fair shake. One last example is that in 1996, a rule was passed that in order to collect your benefits, you had to be, if you were a legal immigrant, you had to reside within the United States. So that meant if you came from Mexico and you worked in the United States and you paid your payroll taxes enough to get benefits, if you moved back to Mexico, they wouldn't send you a check. But if your parents were, say, British, and you were getting Social Security benefits, the same benefits, and you decided you wanted to move to Mexico, they'll send you the check. Now, what kind of sense does that make? And also we have to remember that undocumented immigrants are paying the payroll tax. In 2007, they added $12 billion to the Social Security Trust Fund, but they are not eligible to collect any benefits. So these are some things that we need to think about as we go forward. So for the Commission to Modernize Social Security, which included a number of people in this room, we gathered together experts of color from African American, Asian, Pacific American, Latino, and Native American groups to take a look at how we utilize Social Security now in order to figure out how we might improve for the future. We wanted to see what works and what has to be kept. We wanted to see what is racially inequitable and must be changed, and we also wanted to see what is inadequate and must be improved. But our starting point is that the Social Security system is neither broken nor broke, that it simply needs some repairs to the program design, and we needed to find some extra money to pay for those repairs. As Don Berwick mentioned yesterday, what we needed to do was start from what is just, what is equitable, and what is necessary, and not to start from the standpoint of, oh, we don't have enough money, because as he said, our country is up to challenges, and when we have a vision in mind, we will figure out the ways to achieve it. So let's take a look at some of the ways in which Social Security is utilized differently by communities of color than white families. In this graph, you can see that 3 out of 4 white beneficiaries use the retirement feature of the program, whereas only 1 out of 2 African American families or 2 out of 3 of the other groups use the retirement feature. And when I say other, I just want to make the point, too, that looking at the demographic changes, it is really not okay that Social Security does not disaggregate the numbers further. You'll notice that in my data, I don't really have anything for Native Americans, and they are an extremely important population, the original population that we have. So I think a friend of mine says that the failure to disaggregate is death. Because when you're invisible, when you're using that 2D glasses and you're in the background and you're really, nobody's looking at what's going on with you, you can get lost in the shuffle and nothing is done for you. So our attempt is to draw what was in the background into the foreground. You can also see from this that, we often talk about Social Security as a family program. It is even more important to families of color than it is to white families. They use the program even more that way. More than twice as many people of color, mostly women and children, rely on the survivor benefits. And for children, of black beneficiaries, 12% are children, whereas among white beneficiaries, only 4% are children. So it's extremely important to families in our communities. Now, what differences are there in the economic status of communities of color, and how do these affect their utilization of the Social Security program? Well, first of all, we still, in spite of all the talk of being a post-racial society, we still have occupational segregation. They tend to be in low-wage jobs, suffer more periods of unemployment, and to be in jobs where the employers don't provide retirement benefits. For example, as many of you may know, for people who work in low-wage jobs in Walmart, many of them are paid so little that they qualify for Medicaid benefits. So just think about that. We are subsidizing Walmart's billionaire owners while their workers are so low paid. But of course that means that they're paying less into the Social Security system through their payroll tax, so that their benefits are lower. So you can see that compared to white families, their yearly benefits at the median are several $1,000s less. However, in spite of the fact that the benefit amounts are lower, the reliance on Social Security is even greater. So that for a third of white families that get Social Security benefits, for a third of them, Social Security accounts for 90% of their income, but half of all the groups of color who get Social Security benefits rely on Social Security for more than 90% of their income. So hugely reliant, and that's probably the biggest takeaway. This is a survival program for families of color, and we really cannot let it go by the wayside. Again, because of the lower wage jobs, the progressive benefit structure is something that's really important, so that low wage workers get a larger share of their income as their benefit amount than higher earners, and the special minimum benefit that sets a floor for the amount that people who have worked all their lives can receive. There are some, I guess, wait a second, I'm running ahead of myself here. There are some other differences too. They tend to work in more dangerous jobs, leading to health benefits, leading to health problems. For example, farm workers who work with pesticides could be suffering from all kinds of exposures to cancer and other diseases. Vietnamese women working in nail salons, they all seem to be Vietnamese women, are subject also to conditions that cause respiratory problems. So for these reasons, the disability benefit is extremely important, as are the survivor benefits for deceased and disabled workers. Another thing that follows from the being in more dangerous jobs, it means that they need a reasonable age for retirement, early retirement and full retirement. If you are in a job where you are lifting heavy objects all the time, your body simply may not allow you to work those longer years. So life expectancy is not really an issue here for those folks. Another difference is that these populations are more likely to be immigrants, and particularly for Asians, almost 80% of the population were not born in the United States. And because often if they come a little bit later in life, they have a shorter work history, and again, they might have been a professional in their home country, but when they get here, they might be stuck in a low-wage job because of language or other issues, so that, again, they get less in Social Security, and many of them don't get it at all. But when they do, the benefits are absolutely crucial. As I said before, those who are not documented are not eligible for benefits, but those who are legally present, it could be the difference between nothing and $12,000 a year, which is extremely significant. And for those who are naturalized citizens, it's about a $3,000 difference in their income. Life expectancy is also different. For Latinos and Asians, our life expectancy at the age of 65 is actually 3 years greater than for all other families. My mother is helping with that. She's now 96 and cruising to 100. So for Asian women, actually, if you live to 60 to 65, you have a life expectancy of 88 88, and for Latino women, 89. Pretty amazing. However, for Native Americans and African Americans, the life expectancy is shorter. So again, while the COLA is particularly important to Asians and Latinos, and a reasonable COLA benefit, because especially at 85, you're going to need the extra dollars, for African Americans and Native Americans, again, having a reasonable retirement age, not raising that, is extremely important. And in fact, it is kind of adding insult to injury in that those with a shorter lifespan subsidize the benefits for those with higher life expectancy. One other thing to note is the fact that we have different family structures. And this is for New York, but New York represents all of the different racial groups, so it's a good sort of a little snapshot of what it looks like. But for Asian families, they are much more likely to be married and to stay married into old age. So again, the spousal benefit is really beneficial for Asian women. For Latino and African Americans, they're probably less well served by some of the features of Social Security. I mentioned the fact that they have to choose between the two incomes, but they also tend to be mothers. 63% of Latinas are mothers versus 53% of all other women, and it's probably because of the younger population demographic for Latinos, so that more of them are in the childbearing age. So for those who take the time out to care for children, there really is not much there. So again, women, and particularly elderly women, are the poorest members of our society. But one thing that we often don't think about is that the largest reason for this gap is the racial wealth gap. So, you know, the Social Security program, we think about it, and most of the public thinks about it as an income program because you get that check. However, it really is an asset program. It's one of our best, it's our only big asset building program aimed at low income, low wealth people. So Maya Rockymore has calculated that the value of the life insurance feature is $433,000. It's like owning a life insurance policy of $433,000. And that is certainly the largest asset that many of these people will own. Now, just to say that, you know, the wealth gap that we can document and talk about a little bit more, but for women of color, again, between the ages of 36 and 49, had only $5 of wealth, $5, which meant that if their child needed to go on a field trip, they would have to borrow from somebody in order to get up the money to allow their child that learning opportunity. And also that just there's a growing gap. This is not something, you know, we are not getting better when it comes to racial equality. That now the gap between African American and white wealth is $95,000, which means that you could send a child to college or maybe a couple on that amount of money, again, helping make sure the next generation is doing well. And that for, again, so many people in our nation right now of all races have zero wealth, which is another way of saying that they are in debt. And the reasons for this, and I don't have time to go into it, but the reasons for the lack of wealth and the racial wealth gap is not about personal irresponsibility. It's about social irresponsibility and the role of public policy in creating that gap. I mean, just one example is the Federal Housing Administration, which subsidized homes for middle-class Americans, but they also were responsible for redlining and making their mortgage lenders not lend to people of color in inner cities. So yesterday, Brian Smedley talked about residential segregation, and it's not because people chose those patterns, but they were created by public policy. So just to say that we then looked at how is it that we can strengthen Social Security. And we are concerned about the very old, and one of our recommendations is that we would increase by a dollar amount the amount of the benefit that people over 85 would receive. For women, we would change the spousal benefit so that they could get 75% of the combined income of both of the earners in the couple. And we wanted to suggest that there be 5 years of dependent care for women who take time out of the workforce. As we women all know, taking care of children is work, and it is socially useful work. And then other benefit increases. We wanted to restore the benefit for children of deceased or disabled workers up to the age of 22 if they are pursuing some kind of post-secondary education, either vocational or college. And we also wanted to increase the special minimum benefit for those who've worked over 30 years, as well as increasing all benefits by a uniform amount. We feel like this is fair given that people did not create the current recession, and everybody has suffered both in terms of their income and their assets by that. And so, again, we have to shore up that third leg of the three-legged stool. Just to say that, often people think that finding the resources is very difficult once you've set your goal, but we actually found that it was not hard at all. That some of the, I just went through some of the ideas for improving the benefits, but in terms of finding the resources, we agreed with Roosevelt that this works best as a self-contained insurance program. If anything, we need to make better sure that the lockbox is tamper-proof. And we need to let our people know that this is like an insurance policy that they have paid for, so that if you, for example, bought an auto insurance policy, you're certainly not going to not collect on that insurance when your car breaks down. And so many of our people, far from being, wanting to get more than they deserve, often they're too proud to even apply for it. So the most important recommendation in terms of the solvency is to lift the cap. Right now, millionaires pay a 1% effective payroll tax rate, and that is really something that we can address by making them pay on all parts of their income. We could also apply the payroll tax to all earned income, including the wages that are not subject to the income tax. Already, money that goes into a retirement account is taxed, but we could also include money that goes into flexible spending accounts, for example, that some employers of higher paid workers have. And then actually, we know that people are willing to pay more for Social Security, and we could slowly raise the payroll tax by 1/20th of 1% over 20 years. Now, I just wanted to say, too, that, the two sides balance, and you can take a look at our report, or we can talk about that more, but the money can be raised quite easily to pay for the improvements. I just wanted to say that one problem we have right now is the payroll tax holiday being portrayed as a tax cut is not helpful to us and makes our job in terms of arguing for improving benefits and raising revenues harder. Maybe you might want to talk about that. So I'll just end by saying that the Social Security program is really dedicated to the principle that all those who have contributed their labor and their lives to building the country should not be allowed to die in poverty. The elderly poverty rates that we have, all our poverty rates, are a national shame, and the enduring racial economic gap is also a national shame. And if we want to demonstrate our competence as a democratic country on the world stage, especially among the rising nations of the global South who do see the world in 3D, we must make good on that promise. So we have two tasks in Social Security reform: to improve the benefits for everyone, and also to use it as a tool to cut the racial economic gap. Almost a half a century ago, Martin Luther King said, "There's nothing new about poverty. What is new is that we have the technology and the resources to eliminate poverty. What we lack is the will." However, I guess in the terms of the question of will, we have a new generation who don't want to entrust their futures to the Wall Street institutions that gave them the student debts that they're burdened with into the future, or that caused the foreclosure of their parents' homes. And secondly, we have this rising demographic who understands social insurance because they use it all the time. It's called family insurance. It's about sharing the risks and the resources among your family. And they understand that the bigger the family, the better off you are. So how about an insurance program that includes everyone in the country? That's the best way to ensure individual security. So the alternative to Social Security is social insecurity, and that's a cost our nation can't afford. Thanks.
We have a few minutes for questions. And again, the mics are there, and there's a roving mic back at the back. If anybody has any questions for the panel. I have a question for Ken. If we push to look at this in terms of cash flow, does it help us or hurt us with making arguments when that's really what the budgeteers are also doing? They're saying, well, there's only the payroll tax coming in, and they're looking at the cash flow from the budget point of view, because of course when we do turn in, or when we do use our interest, that money the general fund has a problem. We don't have a problem. Social Security definitely doesn't have a problem, but the general fund has a problem. So I wonder how you see that playing out in the big picture.
Well, I think that I would just clarify that my remarks here were focused on the cash flow adequacy of the OASDI system in isolation. And I hope that the numbers that I quoted will help to sort of reinforce the message that it is very strongly financed. Now, I also addressed this other issue of the fact that we are facing this lent or spent dilemma. And very true that when we look at the federal government financial operations in aggregate, we get a very different picture. And it is indeed a worrisome picture. We know we have huge deficits, and certainly to some minds, to some thinkers there in the political landscape, the FICA contributions are simply a part of the available resources that are being used and spent, and that the federal budget deficits are being partially offset by diverting those Social Security contributions. I think we have to address both issues. You cannot hide from, you cannot deny the existence of both issues. But I think that for the message of the strength of Social Security, the arguments I have presented, I think, are perfectly valid. And I would think that if we have the right response and message very clearly and address the issue coherently, it should help us rather than hurt us. So I'd be inclined to vote in favor of saying that it should help us. But I think certainly we've got an uphill battle in addressing those issues.
We have a question over here.
Yes, hi, Maria Brown from Syracuse University. I've sort of been refraining from asking this question, like from every panel so far in the conference, but because we specifically were talking about minorities in your presentation, I wanted to ask you this question. There's a subset of minorities in this country called LGBT families and elders who are completely invisible in all of our discussions about social insurance. And I was just wondering if you'd given any thought to that, if any of you had given any thought to that, any of you, and what your thinking was on overturning DOMA and including those families into the policy conversation that we're having about how to make Social Security more equitable and social insurance more equitable.
No, absolutely. There are certainly LGBT families in every demographic. And so in thinking about particularly the issue of the couples, the American family has changed drastically, and that's one of the ways in which it needs to be modernized. So, for example, the child care credit, I think this was mentioned yesterday, would definitely help all couples married legally or not. That's certainly one way of looking at that.
Well, actually, it doesn't help couples who are not legally married because, well, it helps individuals who are not married. But I'm thinking more about couples who one partner dies and they didn't legally adopt their children before they died, so the children don't get the survivor's benefit because their marriage is not legal on the federal level, or survivors of retirees who died but they never were legally recognized by the federal government, so you lose half your household income and you have no hope of even taking the higher benefit. You just lose it, and you end up in greater risk of poverty just because you're a sexual minority.
No, those are legitimate issues and also needed to be added into the mix because the point is to make it as inclusive and universal as possible. But again, the numbers of people, we would like to see the right to marry for everyone who wants to marry, but the numbers of people who are actually marrying in every demographic is falling. So again, we really have to examine the structure of the American family and to make adjustments based on that.
Not have it dependent on marriage so much.
That would be great. Yeah, as I said, again, for some of these minority groups, they are less likely to be married. Thank you. Great question.
Let us thank our panel. And in conclusion,